There is a man on a kitchen floor in Denver. His name doesn't matter yet. What matters is this. His phone is cracked on the tile 3 inches from his hand, and his fingers won't close around it. His chest feels like someone is tightening a vise from the inside. His vision is narrowing, the edges going soft, the world shrinking to a circle the size of a dinner plate. He is 36 years old. He runs a company. He has a system for everything. His mornings, his meetings, his meals, his emotions. He has spent 6 years building a life so controlled, so airtight, so perfectly defended against the unpredictable that not a single person on earth knows where he is right now. And that's the problem, because he is dying. Maybe, probably. He isn't sure. But his body has stopped consulting him on the matter, and the apartment is very quiet, and the ceiling above him is the last thing he might ever see. Then the intercom buzzes. A voice, female, unhurried, professional in the way people are professional when they've said the same sentence 400 times, comes through the speaker. "Hello, Merritt? I've got your order from Rosario's." He tries to answer. What leaves his mouth isn't language. It's breath with ambition. But the intercom is still live, and the voice on the other end goes silent for exactly 1 beat. Then it changes, the professionalism replaced by something sharper, something alert. "Sir, are you okay?" No response. "Sir, I'm coming up." A stranger saved his life that night. A delivery driver in flour-dusted sneakers who had no business being on the 14th floor, who broke 2 building codes and 1 company policy to get through a service door she should never have memorized the code to. She knelt beside him on the tile and spoke to him like he was a person, not a patient. She called 911 with a calm that surprised even her. She stayed until the paramedics arrived, 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, and when the elevator doors closed on the stretcher, she was left standing in the hallway holding his cracked phone and a bag of cold pasta carbonara. She left the food on his counter. She left a note on a napkin, and she had no idea, none, that the man she'd just pulled back from the edge had spent 6 years making sure no one ever got that close. To understand what happened after that night, you need to understand the man who stood on that kitchen floor before he fell. You need to understand 47 women he refused to let in, a funeral where his hands wouldn't stop shaking, and a system so perfectly designed to keep him safe that it nearly killed him. But most of all, you need to understand the door, the one he deadbolted from the inside the day he buried his father. Because the woman who saved his life on that kitchen floor, she wasn't trying to open it. She was just the first person honest enough to tell him it was closed. This is an American love story, and it begins where most love stories are afraid to, with a man who had everything under control, and the single moment that proved control was the most dangerous thing he owned. If this is your first time here, welcome to Marble Heart, where we tell the stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Subscribe now because you don't want to miss how this one ends. Thursday, late October, Denver. The apartment occupied the 14th floor of a steel and glass building on 17th Street, the kind of building where the lobby smelled like engineered calm and the elevators moved so quietly you could forget you were rising. Declan Merritt had chosen it for exactly that quality: silence, efficiency, the absence of friction. He'd been home for 20 minutes, 14-hour day, jacket on the hook, shoes aligned by the door, laptop charging on the desk at precisely the angle that allowed the cord to reach without tension. Small rituals, the architecture of a man who believed that if you controlled enough of the minor variables, the major ones would fall in line. The tightness started at 9:47 p.m. He noticed it the way you notice a sound in a room you've been sitting in too long, not suddenly, but with the slow recognition that it had been there for a while and you'd only just stopped ignoring it. A compression behind his sternum, dull, persistent. He cataloged it as stress. 14 hours. 3 client calls that ran long. A vendor in Phoenix who couldn't read a shipping manifest. The body accumulates these things. He poured a glass of water, drank half, set it on the island. The compression became pressure. The pressure found his left shoulder. Declan set both hands flat on the granite countertop and took a measured breath, the kind his trainer had taught him. 4 counts in, 7 counts out. Control the breath, control the body. He'd built an entire life on that principle. His left arm went numb at 9:51. 4 minutes. That's all it took for the system to fail. 4 minutes between the first dismiss signal and the moment his knees buckled and he caught the edge of the island on the way down. Not a dramatic collapse, not the kind of fall that announces itself, but a quiet folding, like a building settling into its own foundation. He hit the tile on his right side. His phone, which had been resting on the counter near the water glass, slid off the granite and cracked against the floor. The screen fractured in a pattern that looked, absurdly, like a river delta. He watched it land. He thought, with the peculiar clarity that comes when the brain knows it's losing altitude, I should have gone with the protective case. His fingers wouldn't close. He could see the phone. He could see the cracked screen still glowing, the time still visible, 9:52. But the distance between seeing and reaching had become an ocean. His hand twitched. His arm didn't follow. The ceiling was white, textured. He'd never looked at it from this angle. He'd lived in this apartment for 3 years and never once seen the ceiling from the floor, and now it was all he could see, and the thought that arrived, unwelcome, uninvited, was this: no one knows I'm here. Not his mother in Pueblo. Not his assistant who'd left at 6. Not a single one of the 47 women his mother had introduced him to over the past 6 years, because he had made sure, methodically, deliberately, politely, that none of them had a reason to call at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. The system had worked. That was the unbearable part. The system had done exactly what he designed it to do. It had kept everyone at a distance. It had ensured that his life was entirely, completely, structurally his own. And now his life was compressing into a circle the size of a dinner plate, and there was no one to call even if his fingers could dial. The intercom buzzed at 9:53. The sound reached him the way sounds reach you when your consciousness is thinning, muffled, lagged, like hearing someone speak from the far end of a long hallway. The buzz came again. Then a voice piped through the speaker he'd left active from an earlier delivery. Hello, Merritt? I've got your order from Rosario's. Rosario's. The carbonara. He'd ordered it at 7, before the world narrowed. An automated habit. Thursday night, same dish, same restaurant. The kind of routine that requires no decision-making, which was the entire point. He tried to speak. His mouth opened. Air moved. But the word that was supposed to be help came out as something less. A syllable without edges. A sound that could have been anything or nothing. But the intercom was live. And Nola Vega, 29 years old, 5'6" in her delivery sneakers, 11 months into a job she'd taken as a temporary reset, heard it. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1 beat. Not long enough to be hesitation, just long enough to be recognition. The sound of someone who'd spent 3 years in crisis work hearing, in a half-formed syllable, the difference between a person who's fine and a person who isn't. Sir, are you okay? The ceiling offered no answer. Sir, I'm coming up. She used the service entrance code, memorized from repeat deliveries, Tuesdays and Thursdays, always the 14th floor, always carbonara, always a clean 20% tip left in the app before the food arrived. She'd never met the man behind the orders. He was a name on a screen, a door that opened just wide enough for a handoff, a polite nod she sometimes caught and sometimes didn't. She found him on the kitchen floor. What happened in the next 3 minutes and 40 seconds was not heroic in the way that word is usually meant. Nola did not perform surgery. She did not deliver a speech about holding on. She knelt beside a stranger on cold tile and did the thing her training had wired into her bones. She called 911, gave the dispatcher the address, described the symptoms with a precision that would later impress the responding paramedics. And then she sat down next to him and said, Hey, you're not doing this alone. I'm right here. Declan looked at her. This woman he had never spoken to. Flour dust on her jacket. A bag of pasta carbonara still hanging from her left hand. Dark eyes that were neither panicked nor pitying, just present. Fully, unshakably present. I can't feel my arm, he said. I know, that's okay. The ambulance is 4 minutes out. Tell me something, anything. Keep talking. I don't, he clenched his jaw. I don't know what to say. Then tell me your name, your real first name, not the one on the buzzer. He almost laughed. The absurdity of it, a stranger on his kitchen floor asking for the one thing he never gave freely. His name, not his title, not his firm, not the version of himself that fit on a business card, just the name. Declan. Declan, good, I'm Nola, and you're going to be fine, Declan, you hear me? He heard her. He heard the way she said his name. Without pity, without performance, without the careful modulation people use when they're managing someone else's crisis from a safe emotional distance. She said it the way you say the name of someone you've already decided to help, and the decision is settled, and there's nothing left to negotiate. Something lodged, somewhere behind the sternum, in a space he hadn't known was still accessible. Not the cardiac pain, something else. Something that felt, for the first time in 6 years, like being found. The paramedics arrived at 9:56. Declan was conscious when they lifted him onto the stretcher. His eyes found Nola as they wheeled him toward the elevator. She was standing in the hallway, holding his cracked phone in one hand and the bag of now cold carbonara in the other, and she gave him a single nod. Not a wave, not a tearful goodbye. A nod. The kind of acknowledgement one person gives another when something has passed between them that doesn't yet have a name. The elevator doors closed. Nola went back inside. She set the food on his counter. She found a napkin in the delivery bag, pulled a pen from her jacket pocket, and wrote 5 words. Nola Rosarios, glad you're okay. Then underneath, don't forget to eat when you're back. She let herself out, locked the door behind her, took the service elevator to the lobby, got in her car, sat in the parking garage for 4 minutes without starting the engine. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until now. To understand the man on the floor, you have to understand the man before the floor. And the man before the floor was a machine that looked like a person. Declan Merritt's alarm went off at 5:14 a.m., not 5:15. The extra minute was deliberate, a 1-minute margin he'd carved out years ago on the theory that a single minute of advantage compounded daily amounted to 6 hours a year that no competitor would ever think to claim. Whether that math held up didn't matter. The ritual did. The discipline of choosing 5:14 over 5:15 was the point. It was a declaration, made every morning in the dark, that he was the kind of man who did not round up. Coffee by 5:22, brewed at precisely 180 degrees, not because he could taste the difference between 180 and 175, but because precision was a language and he spoke it fluently. Inbox cleared before the sun crested the front range. Gym by 6, not for the mirror, but for the controlled discomfort. 40 minutes of resistance training that reminded his body who was in charge. Shower, suit, the elevator at 7:05, adjusting a cufflink as the doors closed, a gesture so practiced it had become. Unconscious, the last checkpoint before he stepped into the version of himself the world was allowed to see. His firm occupied the 8th floor of a glass-walled building downtown. Merritt Logistics Consulting. Lean, profitable, entirely his. No partners, no board of directors, no investors with opinions. The client list was curated. The margins were healthy. The operation ran the way Declan believed all things should run, with minimal dependence on variables he couldn't control. He was good at this. Everyone said so. His clients said so. The industry publication that profiled him 2 years ago said so. What no one said, because no one was close enough to notice, was that the firm wasn't just a business. It was an exoskeleton, a structure built around a man who had decided, at some point he could no longer precisely identify, that competence was a safer foundation than connection, that being indispensable was more reliable than being loved. The women started with his mother. Renata Merritt had been setting up introductions since Declan turned 31, the age she'd privately designated as the threshold beyond which a single son became a cause for concern rather than a source of mild curiosity. She approached the project with the same focus she'd once brought to organizing the PTA fundraiser at the elementary school, where she taught for 32 years. Thorough research, careful vetting, absolute confidence in her own judgment. 47, she said one Tuesday, calling from the kitchen in Pueblo, where she'd raised 2 children and buried a husband. 47 women I've found for you, good women, smart, kind, beautiful women, and you have rejected every single one. I didn't reject them, Declan said. He was in the elevator, adjusting the cufflink. Always the elevator, always the cufflink. I declined to continue. That is the same thing, Declan. It isn't. Rejection implies judgment. I simply recognized incompatibility. Renata exhaled, the specific exhale of a mother swallowing the sentence she'd been rehearsing since breakfast. Your father, God rest him, was not compatible with me either. I was a school teacher from Pueblo. He was a welder who read philosophy at lunch. On paper, we made no sense, but we made 41 years. He didn't answer right away. He never did when she mentioned his father. The silence wasn't grief exactly, or not the kind people assumed. It was something more guarded, a door that opened onto a room he'd sealed off, and every mention of Martin Merritt was a hand on the knob. His father had died 6 years ago. Heart failure, the real kind, the kind with a medical file and a prognosis and an ending. Declan had stood at the funeral in a charcoal suit that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger, and his hands had shaken. Not a tremor, a full, visible shaking that he could not stop, not through willpower, not through breathing, not through any of the systems he'd spent his adult life constructing. He had stood in front of 200 people and come apart in the most public, most exposed, most irreversible way a man can come apart. And afterward, in the car, in the silence, in the weeks that followed, he had drawn a conclusion that would govern the next 6 years of his life. Vulnerability was not intimacy. It was a door left unlocked, and anyone who walked through it could take whatever they wanted. So the system took shape, not overnight. Gradually, the way scar tissue forms, layer by layer, each one a little thicker than the last, until the original wound is buried so deep it stops hurting and starts functioning as architecture. The blind dates became a ritual he endured out of respect for his mother, not out of hope for himself. He showed up. He wore the right shirt. He chose restaurants with good lighting and interesting menus. He asked questions that sounded personal but weren't. What do you do? Where did you grow up? Have you traveled recently? The answers washed over him like background noise because he wasn't listening for content. He was listening for the moment the conversation would turn, the inevitable pivot towards something that mattered, something that required him to offer a piece of himself in return. And when that moment came, he left, politely, graciously, with a handshake or a light touch on the shoulder, and a line about how much he'd enjoyed the evening and how busy the next few weeks looked. 47 times. Not because the women were wrong. Some of them were brilliant. Some were funny in ways that caught him off guard. One, a pediatric surgeon with a quiet laugh and a habit of folding her napkin into small triangles while she talked, had made him pause. Actually pause. He'd sat in his car after that dinner and felt something shift behind the walls, like furniture being rearranged in a room he thought he'd emptied. He didn't call her back, because the version of himself these women would eventually need, the open, yielding, imperfect version, the one with shaking hands and an unlocked door, was a version he had buried so deep he was no longer certain it still existed. And if it did exist, he was no longer certain he could survive the cost of letting someone find it. The systems we build to protect ourselves are not always made of locks and steel. Sometimes they are made of punctuality, of clean margins and curated distance and the precise temperature of morning coffee. Sometimes the most fortified walls in a person's life don't look like walls at all. They look like discipline. They look like success. They look from the outside like a man who has everything together. And that is the loneliest architecture there is, because it works. It keeps everyone out, every last one, including the people who might have been worth letting in. The diagnosis was a minor cardiac event, not a heart attack, a warning. The cardiologist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Fenn, looked at his chart, looked at him and said, "You're not dying, but you're living like someone who's daring the universe to make the first move." Stress-induced, reversible, if he was willing to reverse the life that caused it. Declan spent 4 days in the hospital. He answered emails from the bed. He reorganized a client proposal on his laptop between blood draws. A nurse asked if there was anyone she should call, and he said no with a speed that embarrassed them both. He came home on a Monday afternoon. Everything was where he'd left it. The jacket on the hook, the shoes by the door, the laptop on the desk, cord angled to avoid tension. Nothing had moved. Nothing had changed, except the kitchen floor. He stood at the island and looked down at the tile and felt something his system had no category for, a memory that wouldn't file itself into the correct folder and close. Every time he stood in that spot, he saw himself on the ground, helpless, fingers that wouldn't close, ceiling he'd never studied from that angle. And he saw her, kneeling, calm, a bag of carbonara hanging from one hand like a detail from someone else's story that had wandered into his. The napkin was still on the counter. 5 words in blue ink. Nola, Rosario's, glad you're okay. And underneath, don't forget to eat when you're back. He called Rosario's on Wednesday, asked for Nola, was told she only worked delivery shifts on Tuesdays and Thursdays. On Thursday, he ordered the carbonara. She arrived at 7:22 p.m., same jacket, same sneakers. She stood in the doorway holding the bag, and when he opened the door, fully upright, color in his face, dressed in a sweater instead of a suit for the first time in recent memory, she studied him for 3 full seconds. "You look better vertical." He laughed, not the controlled exhale he usually offered as a substitute, a real laugh, involuntary, the kind that catches you before you can decide whether to allow it. "I wanted to thank you," he said, properly. "You just did. I mean, can I take you to dinner to thank you?" Nola tilted her head. She had dark eyes that didn't rush to conclusions, that took their time assessing a situation before offering a verdict. You want to take the delivery girl to dinner because she did the bare minimum of calling 911? It wasn't the bare minimum. He said it simply, without performance. You stayed. You didn't have to stay. The 911 call was enough. Staying was something else. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her weighing it, not the invitation but the man behind it. Whether this was gratitude or something wearing gratitude's clothes. Tuesday, she said. I'm off at 6. Pick somewhere that doesn't make me feel like I need a different jacket. He chose a taqueria in 5 points. This was a deliberate act, and it's worth pausing here to understand why. In 6 years and 47 introductions, Declan had selected restaurants the way he selected everything, strategically. Places with curated wine lists and waitstaff who remembered your name. Places designed to communicate a specific message. I am successful. I am in control. I belong in rooms like this. The restaurants were never for the women. They were armor, another layer of the system, ensuring that even dinner existed on his terms. The taqueria had plastic chairs and a salsa bar and a jukebox in the corner that only played half its songs. He chose it because he wanted Nola to feel comfortable. But more than that, and this was the part that unsettled him, he wanted to feel comfortable himself. For the first time in 6 years, he wasn't performing. He was just showing up. Over carnitas and horchata, he learned who she was. Nola Vega, 29, degree in social work from Metro State, 3 years at a community crisis center, the kind of place where you sit across from people on the worst day of their lives and try to be the steadiest thing in the room. She'd been good at it. Too good. The kind of good that eventually costs you, because when you hold other people's crises long enough, the weight doesn't leave when they do. It stays in your shoulders. It follows you home. She'd burned out at 27, left the center, took the delivery job as what she called a temporary reset, a phrase she said with the self-aware half-smile of someone who knew the reset was approaching its first anniversary and the word temporary was doing increasingly heavy lifting. She lived with her younger brother Tomas, who was finishing a welding apprenticeship. Their parents had moved back to Guanajuato when she was 24, a decision she described without bitterness, just the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who'd made peace with a complicated thing by refusing to pretend it was simple. She'd stayed because Colorado was the only home that fit. The mountains, the dry air, the particular quality of light in October that she said made everything look like it was leaning towards something. She asked him questions too, but not the kind he was used to deflecting, the polished first-date questions that stayed on the surface like stones skipping across water. Nola's questions landed differently. They came from years of sitting with people who didn't have the energy to be anything but honest, and they carried that same directness, not aggressive, just uninterested in pretense. What do you do when you're not almost dying on your kitchen floor? I run a consulting firm, logistics. You like it? He paused. No one had asked him that before. Not with that particular inflection, the one that suggested the answer actually mattered, that she wasn't asking to fill silence but because she genuinely wanted to know. I'm good at it, he said. That's not what I asked. There it was, the question underneath the question. The door he kept bolted and barricaded and hidden behind a shelf full of competence and routine. She hadn't tried to force it open. She hadn't even knocked. She'd simply stood in front of it and observed with calm precision that it existed. I used to like it, he said. I think now I mostly need it. Nola nodded slowly, the way a person nods when an answer is enough for now, when pushing further would break something that's only just beginning to open. She didn't try to fix the statement, didn't reframe it into something softer or more optimistic. She dipped a chip in salsa and said, Fair enough. Need is honest. A lot of people can't even get to honest. And Declan sat there, in a plastic chair, in a taqueria with a broken jukebox, across from a woman who delivered pasta for a living and had just, in 7 words, given him more permission to be himself than 47 carefully curated dinners ever had. The people who change us most are rarely the ones who arrive with grand entrances and rehearsed wisdom. They're the ones who ask the question no one else thought to ask, the small, obvious question that's been sitting in the middle of the room for years, waiting for someone brave enough or blunt enough to pick it up. Do you like it? 3 words. And the entire system flinched. Here's what's worth noticing. For the first time in 6 years, Declan Merritt had chosen a place where he could be comfortable, not impressive, not defended, just present. And the woman sitting across from him hadn't asked him to perform, hadn't needed the wine list or the waitstaff who remembered names. She just needed the truth, and he'd given her a piece of it. Over the weeks that followed, something began to shift in Declan Merritt, something his system had no file for, no protocol to manage, no morning routine to contain. But before we show you what he built with Nola, you need to see what broke him in the first place. Because the walls she was slowly thinning didn't begin with 47 blind dates. They began at a funeral, with shaking hands, and a grief so public it taught him to never be that open again. That story is next. And if you're still here, if something in this man's defense system feels familiar to you, if you've ever built your own version of the 5:14 alarm in the curated restaurant and the polite exit before the conversation turns real, stay with us, because what's coming is the moment that explains everything. They saw each other 6 times in 3 weeks. The second time was tacos again. Same taqueria, same plastic chairs, but this time she brought hot sauce from a bodega in Westwood that she said would ruin every other hot sauce for him permanently. She was right. The third time was a bookstore crawl through Capitol Hill. 3 shops in 4 hours. She moved through shelves the way some people move through museums, slowly, with her head tilted, reading spines like they were the names of old friends she hadn't decided whether to call. In the last shop, she found a dog-eared copy of a telenovela novelization shelved in the literary fiction section and laughed so hard the clerk looked up from his register. Declan watched her laugh. He cataloged the way it changed her face, not because he was studying her, but because his mind did this automatically, filed things, organized them. Except this time the filing system stuttered. There was no folder for the way Nola Vega laughed, no column in the spreadsheet, no protocol. He was starting to notice that a lot of things about her had no protocol. 6 years earlier, a Tuesday in April, a cemetery in Pueblo with a view of the Sangre de Cristos that Martin Merritt would have appreciated, because he'd been the kind of man who noticed mountains. The suit was charcoal. Declan had bought it 3 days before the funeral and had it tailored in 2. It fit perfectly. That was the problem. It fit like it belonged to the man he was supposed to be at this moment, the composed eldest son, the one who handled logistics, who made calls, who stood at the front of the room and said the words that needed saying. 200 people. That's how many came. Martin Merritt had been a welder and a union man and a reader of philosophy who could quote Marcus Aurelius while repairing a bridge support, and he had been loved. In the way that quiet, steady men are loved, not loudly but deeply, by people who had watched him show up for 40 years and never once make it about himself. Declan stood at the graveside. He had notes in his jacket pocket, a eulogy he'd written and rewritten until the sentences were clean and balanced and said exactly what they should. He reached for the notes. His hand was shaking, not a tremor, not the slight vibration of nerves that most people feel before public speaking. A full, visible, uncontrollable shaking that traveled from his fingers to his wrist to his forearm, and no amount of willpower could make it stop. He pressed his hand flat against his thigh. It kept shaking. He gripped the edge of the podium. The podium shook with him. He gave the eulogy. He doesn't remember most of it. What he remembers is the sensation of being peeled open in front of 200 people. The grief coming out of him not as tears, not as composed sadness, but as a physical rebellion his body staged against every system of control he'd ever built. His voice broke twice. His hands never stopped. And when it was over, when he stepped away from the podium and walked back to his seat, he could feel every pair of eyes in that cemetery on the back of his neck, and each one felt like a hand reaching for something he hadn't offered. In the car afterward, alone, he sat in the driver's seat for 40 minutes without starting the engine. The shaking had stopped by then. His hands were still. And in that stillness, in the silence of a parking lot behind a funeral home in Pueblo, Colorado, Declan Merritt made a decision that would shape the next 6 years of his life. He would never be that exposed again. Vulnerability was not intimacy. It was a door left unlocked. And anyone who walked through it could take whatever they wanted. Your grief, your weakness, the parts of you that didn't fit the suit. He would bolt that door. He would build a shelf in front of it. He would construct a life so ordered, so competent, so thoroughly defended, that no moment, no person, no loss would ever have the leverage to open him like that again. And it worked. For 6 years, it worked. Until a woman who delivered pasta carbonara knelt beside him on a kitchen floor and said his name like it was a rope she was throwing. The 4th time they met was a Sunday morning hike at Red Rocks. Nola walked too fast. Declan kept pace and said nothing about the fact that Dr. Fenn had explicitly told him to keep his heart rate below 130 for at least another month. The trail was steep and the November air was sharp, and at the top she turned around and caught him breathing harder than he should have been and said, "You're not fooling anyone, you know." "I don't know what you mean." Your cardiologist told you to take it easy. I can see it in the way you're pretending you're fine. I am fine. You're fine the way a man who just had a cardiac event is fine after hiking a 60-degree incline, which is not fine. Sit down. He sat down, on a rock in the cold morning light, with the city of Denver spread out below them like a circuit board. She sat next to him, close enough that their jackets touched. Neither of them mentioned it. The fifth time was dinner at his apartment. The first time she'd been back since the night she found him on the floor. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the tile and didn't say anything, but he saw her eyes move to the spot, and he knew she was remembering, and he knew she knew he was watching her remember. The sixth time was coffee and a 2-hour walk through City Park where they talked about nothing important and everything underneath it. His walls were doing something they had never done before. Not crumbling, not collapsing. The mortar wasn't failing, but the walls were thinning, becoming translucent. For the first time, he could almost see through them to whatever was on the other side. He could almost make out the shapes. And that terrified him, because here is the thing about walls that no one tells you. They only feel like protection from the inside. From the outside, they just look like distance. And Nola, who had spent 3 years sitting with people in crisis, could read distance the way a navigator reads a coastline. Every contour, every inlet, every place where the shore pretended to be solid but was actually eroding underneath. The seventh time. His balcony. November dusk. The sun was dissolving behind the front range, turning the mountains into a layered silhouette, blue fading to black, the sky above them the color of a bruise healing. They'd been sitting in the kind of silence that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill it. And then she said something simple. I like being around you, Declan. I want you to know that. His chest tightened. Not the cardiac kind. The other kind. The one that comes when someone offers you something you haven't earned and don't know how to hold. The same tightening he'd felt when his hand shook at the podium. The same exposure. The same door, creaking open on hinges he thought he'd welded shut. Nola, you don't have to say it back. I'm just telling you where I am. He should have met her there. Should have said, I think about you when the apartment gets too quiet. Your voice is the first thing I replay. You're the only person in 6 years who's made. The walls feel like a choice instead of a sentence. He should have said any version of the truth. Instead, he said, I think we should slow down. Nola didn't flinch, but something shifted behind her eyes. A recalibration, quick and precise, the way a person recalibrates when the ground they trusted turns out to be thinner than they thought. Slow down, she repeated. I'm still recovering. The doctor said stress. Don't do that. Her voice was calm, firm, not angry, something more careful than anger. Don't use your health as a shield. If you're scared, say you're scared. If you don't feel the same way, say that, but don't dress it up as medical advice. He looked at her. She looked back. The silence between them had a specific shape now, the exact dimensions of the thing he was refusing to say. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. Do what? Let someone in without losing control of what they find. It was the most honest sentence he'd spoken in 6 years. More honest than the eulogy. More honest than anything he'd said on 47 dates in 47 restaurants with 47 women who never got close enough to hear it. Nola heard it. All of it, including the parts he didn't say out loud. She stood, gathered her jacket, paused at the sliding door. I'm not asking to find anything, Declan. I'm asking to be here. But if here means I'm always standing outside a locked door, then I need to know that too. She left, not angry, not wounded in the way people are wounded when they've been surprised by rejection. She left the way a person leaves when they've seen something clearly and decided not to lie about it. Declan stayed on the balcony. The mountains were black now, featureless, just shapes against a darker sky. The city below was humming, traffic, lights, the collective motion of 1 million people moving forward through their evenings without noticing that one man on the 14th floor had just stood perfectly still while the only person who mattered walked out of his apartment and into the elevator and out of the building and into a night that was getting colder by the minute. Fear doesn't always look like running. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like a man on a balcony who had every word he needed and chose silence instead. Not because he didn't feel it, but because feeling it was the one thing his system was never designed to survive. She didn't leave because she stopped caring. She left because she refused to pretend the distance wasn't there. And Declan, the man with a protocol for every morning and a framework for every quarter and a 5-step process for every decision he'd ever made, had no system for the silence that followed, no spreadsheet, no margin to optimize, just a balcony and a sliding door and the ghost of a sentence he should have said hanging in the cold air like breath. What came next would either break the pattern for good, crack it open the way the kitchen floor cracked open his illusion of control, or prove that some people are too well defended to be reached, even by the person willing to try the hardest, even by the person who knelt on the tile and said his name like a rope. If you've made it this far into Declan's story, you already know something about him that most people never learn about the guarded people in their lives. You know what's behind the wall. The question now is whether he's willing to know it too. Stay with us. 3 weeks. That's how long the silence lasted. 21 days, 504 hours. Declan didn't count them. He wasn't that far gone, but his body counted them for him. Every Thursday evening around 7:22, his hand moved toward his phone with a muscle memory that had no business existing after only 6 dinners and a bag of carbonara. He caught himself each time, set the phone down, opened his laptop, returned to the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet was safe. The spreadsheet didn't ask questions with inflections that mattered. The spreadsheet didn't tilt its head and wait for the answer underneath the answer. The spreadsheet was the last room in the house where the system still held, and Declan moved into it the way a man moves into the only room that hasn't flooded. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's dry. He worked. 14-hour days again, despite Dr. Fenn's explicit warning. He took on 2 new clients he didn't need. He restructured a supply chain model for a manufacturer in Salt Lake that could have waited until January. He filled every hour with tasks that demanded precision, and offered in return the narcotic of being too busy to feel. But the cracks were there. Hairline fractures in the concentration he'd always been able to command on demand. He'd be midway through a cost analysis, numbers clean on the screen, margins lining up exactly as they should, and he'd hear her laugh. Not a memory of the laugh exactly, something less organized than that, a sensation. The particular frequency of Nola Vega standing in a Capitol Hill bookstore, holding a telenovela novelization, head thrown back, the sound coming out of her unguarded and full, the kind of laugh that doesn't ask permission first. He'd blink, refocus, return to the numbers. Then, an hour later, mid-call with a client in Phoenix, the same vendor who couldn't read a shipping manifest, the same voice he'd heard 100 times, and underneath it, playing on a frequency only he could access. Don't use your health as a shield. If you're scared, say you're scared. He started sleeping badly. Not insomnia, something subtler. He'd fall asleep at the usual time, in the usual position, in the bed he'd made with the usual precision. But he'd wake at 3 a.m. with a stillness in the apartment that felt different than it had before. The same silence, the same darkness, the same 4 walls. But now, the silence had a shape. It was the exact shape of a woman sitting on a balcony saying, "I like being around you," and a man saying, "Slow down," and a sliding door opening and closing, and footsteps moving through a hallway and an elevator descending 14 floors to a lobby where no one was waiting. He told himself it was adjustment. He told himself the body recalibrates after disruption, and this was recalibration. He told himself that what he felt was the temporary discomfort of a system reasserting itself after a breach. He told himself a lot of things during those 3 weeks. None of them were the truth. His mother called on a Saturday. She didn't mention blind dates. She didn't ask about his health. She didn't open with the usual Renata Merritt production, the weather in Pueblo, the neighbor's dog, the church gossip delivered with theatrical disapproval. Instead, she was quiet for a moment after he said hello, and when she spoke, her voice was stripped of performance. "You sound different." "Different how?" "Quieter, not the good kind. The kind your father got when he was arguing with himself." The mention of his father landed the way it always did. A stone dropped into water he kept trying to convince himself was frozen. But this time the ice was thinner than usual. This time, the ripple traveled. "Mom, I met someone." Silence on the line. Not the brief, tactical silence of a mother preparing her next move. A real silence. The kind that meant she was listening with her whole body. And I did what I always do. I found the exit before the room got too crowded. Renata was quiet for so long that Declan pulled the phone from his ear to check if the call had dropped. When she spoke, there was nothing left in her voice but the truth. No performance, no motherly strategy. Just a woman in a kitchen in Pueblo who had loved a man for 41 years and buried him and was still standing. "Your father used to say that the bravest thing he ever did wasn't the ironwork, It wasn't the union fights. It wasn't any of the hard public things that people respected him for. She paused. He could hear her breathing. He could hear, beneath the breathing, the specific silence of the kitchen where Martin Merritt once sat reading Marcus Aurelius at the table while his coffee cooled. The bravest thing he ever did was letting me see him cry when your sister was born. He told me it felt like handing someone a weapon, giving someone the power to hurt you in a way you can't defend against. And he was right. That's exactly what it is. Another pause. Longer this time. But I never used it against him, Declan. Not once. In 41 years. That's what love is. It's the terrifying bet that the person you let in won't use what they find against you. And if they do, then you survive it. The way you survived your father dying. The way you survived that night on your kitchen floor. You are a Merritt. You survive everything. Her voice shifted. Not louder, but heavier. The weight of what she was about to say pressing down on every syllable. The question is whether surviving is enough, or whether you want something more than that. The call ended the way their calls always ended, with her telling him to eat something and him promising he would. But this time, after he set the phone down, he didn't reach for the laptop. He didn't open the spreadsheet. He didn't fill the silence with a task that demanded precision and offered in return the privilege of not thinking. He sat in the dark. The living room was colorless at this hour. The Denver skyline through the window was a sequence of lit rectangles, other people's lives visible at a distance, each one a small bright box containing whatever it was that people built when they weren't afraid to build it. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time since a parking lot behind a funeral home in Pueblo, Declan Merritt asked himself a question that had no spreadsheet, no framework, no 5-step methodology to answer it. Not, what is safe? Not, what is optimized? Not, what does the system recommend? Just, what do I want? The answer arrived without hesitation. It had been there for weeks, longer maybe, since a kitchen floor, since a napkin note, since a woman in flour-dusted sneakers said his name like it was the only word that mattered in that moment and meant it. He wanted Nola, not the idea of her, not the gratitude, not the story of the delivery girl who saved his life, because that story, however true, reduced her to a function, and she was not a function. She was a woman who asked the questions no one else asked and didn't flinch when the answers were incomplete. She was the person who saw the door and didn't force it and didn't ignore it and simply told the truth about it being there. He wanted her. But wanting, he understood now, was not the hard part. He'd wanted things before and found ways to dismantle them from the inside. The question was not what he wanted. The question, the only question that had ever mattered, the one he'd been spending 6 years and 47 polite exits trying not to face, was whether he was willing to be changed by it. Whether he could let the wanting cost him something. Whether he could walk through the door knowing that what was on the other side would rearrange every room in the house he'd spent so long building. Survival is not the same as living. A man can survive almost anything. Loss, collapse, silence, the slow erosion of years spent alone in a system that functions beautifully and means nothing. Survival is what the body does. Living is what happens when you stop letting survival be enough. He knew what he wanted. He'd known since she knelt beside him on that kitchen floor. But knowing and doing are separated by the widest gap a person can face, the distance between who you've been and who you're willing to become. It is the distance between a locked door and a turned knob. Between a balcony where you stood still and a bench where you might, if you're brave enough, finally sit down and say the true thing. What Declan did next would answer the only question that ever mattered. He found Tomas's number through Rosario's. It took 2 calls. The first went to voicemail, the second was answered on the 4th ring with the silence of a man who already knew who was calling and hadn't decided whether to speak. Yeah. This is Declan Merritt. I'm looking for Nola. I know who you are. Tomas's voice carried the particular weight of a younger brother who had spent 3 weeks watching his sister come home from work, eat dinner without talking, and disappear into her room with a stillness that was worse than sadness because at least sadness moves. She's volunteering at the community center on Colfax, started again 2 weeks ago, support group for young adults. A pause. Then, with the directness of a 24-year-old who had no patience for careful language, if you're going to waste her time again, don't bother. I'm not going to waste her time. How do I know that? Declan paused. The old version of himself would have offered something polished, a reassurance engineered to sound sincere, the verbal equivalent of the curated restaurant and the adjusted cufflink. But the old version of himself was the reason he was making this call in the first place. Because I'm not calling to say what I think she wants to hear. I'm calling because I finally know what I actually need to say. Tomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he gave the address. The community center was a low brick building on Colfax with a mural on the west wall and a parking lot that needed repaving. Nola was outside on a bench near the entrance, thermos of coffee in one hand, notebook open on her lap. November had settled into Denver with intention now. The air had edges, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in whatever you're wearing and reminds you that comfort requires participation. She saw him from 20 feet away. She didn't stand, didn't smile, didn't close the notebook, just watched him approach with the same patience she brought to everything. The patience of a woman who had spent years sitting with people in hard moments and understood that the way someone walks toward you tells you more than the first thing they say. He stopped a few feet from the bench. Can I sit down? It's a public bench. He sat. The cold came through his coat immediately. Neither of them was dressed for a long conversation outdoors, and both of them knew this would be a long conversation, and neither of them suggested going inside. I practiced a speech, he said. On the drive over, it was articulate, structured, hit all the right notes. I'm sure it did. I'm not going to use it. She looked at him then, fully without reservation, the way she'd looked at him on the kitchen floor, and waited. She offered nothing. No bridge, no prompt, just the open space of her attention, which was the most generous and most demanding thing she could have given him. I pushed you away because I was afraid that if you saw all of me, you'd realize I wasn't worth the effort. He kept his eyes on hers. It cost him something visible, a tension in his jaw, a stillness in his hands that was the opposite of the stillness he usually carried. This wasn't control. This was a man holding himself in place so he wouldn't retreat. And I know that sounds like a humble thing to say, but it's actually the most arrogant thing a person can believe, that you get to decide on someone else's behalf what they're willing to love. I took that choice away from you because it was easier to control the loss than to risk it. Nola's expression didn't change, but her grip on the thermos shifted, a small movement, almost invisible, the kind of thing only a person who reads people for a living would notice, or a person who had spent 3 weeks memorizing every detail of her because it was all he had left. Go on. I don't have a system for this, no spreadsheet, no framework, no 5-step process. I just know that the 3 weeks I spent not talking to you were the most honest misery I've felt since my dad died, and I think that means something. I think it means everything. She was quiet. The traffic on Colfax filled the silence. A bus, 2 cars with competing stereos, someone honking at a light that had already turned. The ordinary machinery of a city that didn't know 2 people on a bench were negotiating something that couldn't be undone. I need you to understand something, Declan. Her voice was calm, measured. Not the calm of someone suppressing emotion, the calm of someone who had done the work of feeling it fully and arrived on the other side with clarity. I didn't leave because you weren't ready. I left because you were using your fear as a reason not to try, and I can sit with someone's pain. I've done it professionally. I've done it my whole life. But I can't sit with someone's refusal to even name what they're feeling. That's not closeness. That's a performance of closeness. And I've had enough performances. I know. Do you? Because I need more than an apology. I need to know that the next time something scares you, and it will, Declan, that's what this is, you won't reach for the exit. You'll reach for me instead. He looked at her. The cold had turned her cheeks pink. There was a pen smudge on her left hand and a coffee stain on the cuff of her jacket. The same jacket, the flour-dusted one. The one she'd been wearing the night she saved his life. And he thought, this is what it looks like. The unlocked door. The terrifying, necessary, unlocked door. I will. Not because I'm not scared, because I'm choosing to be here anyway. Nola studied him. The crisis worker in her reading, every micro-expression, every shift in posture, every syllable for the difference between the thing people say when they mean it and the thing they say when they're performing. Whatever she found, in his face, in his hands, in the way he hadn't looked away once, despite the fact that every instinct he'd spent 6 years developing was telling him to, must have passed the test. She set the thermos down, moved the notebook. Then sit closer. It's freezing out here. Weeks later, a Tuesday evening, his apartment. Nola was sitting on the kitchen floor, not because she'd fallen, not because something had gone wrong. She'd walked into the kitchen, looked at the tile, and sat down on it, deliberately, with her back against the island, legs stretched out, coffee mug balanced on her knee, reclaiming the space, rewriting what it meant. Declan stood at the counter and watched her, and something turned over in his chest. Not pain, not fear, but the feeling of watching someone you love do a brave thing so quietly that you almost miss it. He sat down beside her. Same tile, same kitchen, Same floor where his body had failed him, and a stranger had become something more than a stranger. He told her about the funeral, not the version the narrator told, not the observed version, the analyzed version, the one with the literary distance and the retrospective clarity. He told her his version, the shaking hands he couldn't stop, the eulogy he doesn't remember giving, the parking lot afterward where he sat for 40 minutes and decided to never let anyone see him like that again. He told it badly, incomplete sentences, wrong chronology, details that surfaced out of order, because that's how memory actually works when you stop trying to organize it. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "That makes sense, and it's also the loneliest decision a person can make." Then she told him her version, the burnout, not the clinical summary she'd given at the taqueria, the real one. 3 years of holding other people's crises until she couldn't tell where their pain ended and hers began. The guilt of walking away from work she loved because it was consuming her from the inside. The delivery job that was supposed to be a pause, but kept extending because pausing felt safer than going back to a room where someone else's worst day became hers. "I think that's why I stayed that night," she said. She was looking at the tile, tracing a grout line with her finger. "Not just because you needed help, because I needed to remember that showing up for someone in a hard moment doesn't always have to destroy you, that sometimes it can build something instead." He reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he'd initiated contact. A small thing, an ordinary thing, the kind of thing people do without thinking, except he was thinking. He was choosing, and the choice, to reach instead of retreat, to close the distance instead of measuring it, was the bravest thing he'd done since a podium in Pueblo 6 years ago. "Thank you," he said, "for the carbonara, for the napkin note, for telling me to keep talking." She laced her fingers through his. "Thank you for finally talking back." 6 months later, Nola returned to crisis work, part-time at first, 2 afternoons a week at a new center in Aurora. By spring, it was 3 days. She came home tired in a different way than before. Not the hollowed-out exhaustion of someone being consumed by the work, but the solid, grounded fatigue of someone who had learned where the boundaries were and respected them. She was good at it. She always had been. The difference now was that she was good at it without disappearing into it. Declan took on a partner at the firm, a woman named Lena, who had strong opinions about vendor management and no interest in being impressed by his systems. The transition cost him sleep. It cost him control. It cost him the illusion, the last one, the most stubborn one, that he could do everything alone. In return, it gave him Tuesdays off. He spent them with Nola. Sometimes they did nothing. Sometimes nothing was the whole point. They did not move in together right away. They did not rush toward milestones as proof that the love was real. They let it grow the way real things grow, slowly, with setbacks, with Tuesday night arguments about dishes that were never really about dishes, and Wednesday morning apologies that were clumsy and incomplete and genuine in a way that polished apologies never are. Renata called on a Sunday. She had waited months to ask, which was, for Renata Merritt, an act of restraint so extraordinary it deserved its own monument. So, this Nola, is she the one? Declan thought about it. Not because the answer was uncertain, because the answer deserved to be said carefully, with the same precision he'd once reserved for supply chain models and the temperature of morning coffee, redirected now towards something that actually mattered. "She's the one I'm choosing," he said. "Every day, that's what makes it real." Renata was quiet for a moment. Then, very softly, "Your father would have liked her." And for the first time, Declan let that sentence land without bracing for impact. He didn't tighten. He didn't redirect. He didn't treat the mention of Martin Merritt as a stone dropped into water he needed to keep frozen. He let it in. He let it stay. He let it mean what it meant. That the man who had read philosophy at lunch and cried when his daughter was born and handed his wife the weapon of knowing him fully would have recognized what his son was finally learning to do. Love is not a system to be optimized. It is not a risk to be mitigated, or a variable to be controlled, or a door to be bolted from the inside. It is a daily act of courage performed by people brave enough to be ordinary together, to argue about dishes and apologize badly and sit on kitchen floors and choose each other again and again, not because the fear is gone, but because the fear was never the point. 47 women came and went, not because they were wrong, because he hadn't been ready to be right. And the delivery girl who knelt beside him on the coldest floor of his life didn't save him because she was extraordinary, though she was. She saved him because she reminded him of the simplest, most unbearable truth there is. You cannot be loved at a distance, The only version of yourself worth offering is the real one. And the door you've been so afraid to open? It's the same door someone else has been waiting on the other side of, patient, steady, holding a bag of cold pasta and the quiet faith that you'll finally let them in. This has been an American love story, told here on Marble Heart, where we believe the stories that matter most aren't the ones about people who had it all figured out. They're the ones about people who didn't. People who built walls and locked doors and kept the world at arm's length, until one ordinary moment, one unremarkable Tuesday, one stranger with flour on her jacket proved that the bravest thing a person can do is stop surviving alone and start living with someone else. If this story stayed with you, if something in Declan's locked door or Nola's steady patience felt familiar, subscribe to this channel, because we're just getting started. And the next story might be the one that changes how you see your own. Welcome to Marble Heart. We'll see you in the next one.